Hitler's most trusted army vanished from the earth in 8 weeks. Not scattered, not defeated in the traditional sense. Annihilated. 28 divisions, over 300,000 men simply ceased to exist during the summer of 1944. The finest formation the Wehrmacht ever fielded, the spearhead that had driven to the gates of Moscow the anchor of the entire Eastern Front, was obliterated so completely that historians still struggle to find a comparable military catastrophe. This is the story of Operation Bagration, told from the German side, where incompetence met ideology and produced something close to murder on an industrial scale. By June 1944, Army Group Center held a massive, salient bulging into Soviet territory centered on Byelorussia. The position looked impressive on maps, a great fist of German territory stabbing eastward. In reality, it was a trap waiting to spring. The front stretched for over 700 miles, defended by 56 divisions that looked formidable on paper, but were hollow shells of their former strength. 3 years of continuous combat had bled these units white. Replacements arrived in trickles. Equipment requests went unfulfilled. The panzer divisions that had once terrorized Soviet armies now fielded 30 tanks instead of 200. General Ernst Busch commanded this dying giant. A loyal Nazi promoted beyond his abilities, Busch epitomized everything wrong with Hitler's military leadership by 1944. He was not a stupid man, but he was paralyzed by loyalty, terrified of taking initiative, incapable of acting without explicit orders from above. His staff officers saw the danger clearly. Soviet forces had been massing opposite their lines for weeks. Reconnaissance reported huge concentrations of artillery, fresh rifle divisions, entire tank armies moving into position. Every sign pointed to an imminent offensive of catastrophic proportions. Busch did nothing. He could not conceive of acting without Hitler's permission, and Hitler's attention was elsewhere. The Führer had convinced himself that the Soviets would strike in the south toward the Romanian oil fields. Evidence to the contrary was dismissed or ignored. When Busch's intelligence officers presented reports of the Soviet buildup, Hitler's staff explained it away as a deception. The real blow would fall elsewhere. Hold the line, fortify the cities, declare them fortified places, Festung, and defend them to the last man. Above all, do not retreat, not one step back. The Festung concept had become Hitler's obsession. Cities would be transformed into fortresses garrisoned by entire divisions supplied by air if necessary. They would anchor the line, forcing the Soviets to waste time and blood, reducing them, while German mobile forces counterattacked the flanks. In theory, it was sound defensive doctrine. In practice, it was insanity. The Luftwaffe could barely supply a single surrounded garrison, let alone multiple cities, hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. The mobile forces did not exist. The panzer divisions were scattered under strength and committed to holding sectors of the front line. The Festung orders simply guaranteed that when the Soviets broke through, thousands of German soldiers would be sitting in indefensible cities waiting to be encircled. Busch knew this. His staff knew this, but no one dared tell Hitler the emperor had no clothes. Operation Bagration began on June 3, 1944, exactly 3 years after Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The opening barrage was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had experienced. Soviet artillery had become a science by 1944, and what fell on Army Group Center that morning was scientific murder. For 2 hours, over 30,000 guns and rocket launchers pulverized German positions. Entire battalion command posts vanished. Communication lines were severed. Survivors emerged from bunkers to find the world transformed into a moonscape. Then came the infantry. Soviet tactics had evolved far beyond the human wave attacks of 1941. Rifle divisions advanced in small, mutually supporting groups, bypassing strong points, infiltrating weak spots, overwhelming isolated positions before anyone realized the line had broken. Behind them rolled the tank armies, not scattered companies, but entire mechanized formations with hundreds of T-34s, supported by self-propelled guns, engineers, air support. This was deep battle doctrine perfected through 3 years of blood. The German front disintegrated within 48 hours. Not everywhere, isolated strongpoints held out local commanders, launched desperate counterattacks. Some units maintained cohesion, but the front, as a coherent entity, simply ceased to exist. Soviet spearheads punched through at Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk. The penetrations were deep, fast and coordinated. By June 25th, 6 Soviet armies were pouring through gaps 20 miles wide. Bush finally requested permission to withdraw. Hitler refused. The Festung cities would hold. Vitebsk, garrisoned by 4 divisions, would anchor the northern flank. Orsha and Mogilev would block the central advance. Bobruisk would secure the south. These cities would become anvils on which Soviet momentum would shatter. The field divisions would regroup and counterattack. Victory was still possible. None of this bore any relationship to reality. Vitebsk's garrisoned 53rd Corps was surrounded within 3 days. Requests to break out were denied. Hitler's orders were explicit: hold the city, defend to the last man, wait for relief. Relief never came because there was nothing to send. One division commander, recognizing the inevitable, ignored orders and attempted a breakout with a small battle group. They were hunted down in the forests. The rest of the garrison, over 35,000 men, surrendered on June 27th. 4 divisions gone in 5 days. The same pattern repeated at Orsha and Mogilev. Garrisons trapped supplies, dwindling Soviet forces, simply bypassing the cities and driving west. The Festung concept required mobile forces to relieve the surrounded garrisons. Those mobile forces were scattered across hundreds of miles under strength, out of fuel, and desperately trying to avoid encirclement themselves. The cities became tombs. German soldiers sat in cellars and ruins, listening to Soviet tanks rumble past, waiting for relief that would never arrive. Bobruisk illustrated the horror in microcosm. The city sat on the Berezina River, which should have been a natural defensive barrier. Instead, Soviet forces crossed north and south of the city, encircling the garrison before anyone realized what was happening. The 9th Army commander requested permission to evacuate. Permission denied. Bobruisk would hold. By June 28th, Soviet forces had tightened the noose. The garrison attempted a breakout without orders. What else could they do? They were slaughtered in the open. Soviet aircraft strafed the columns. Artillery caught them on the roads. Tanks crushed the survivors. 20,000 men went into the pocket. Perhaps 5,000 escaped. The rest died or surrendered. Hitler fired Bush on June 28th. The Führer needed a scapegoat, someone to blame for the catastrophe unfolding in Byelorussia. Bush's replacement was Field Marshal Walter Model, known as the Führer's fireman, the man who stopped Soviet offensives through sheer willpower and ruthless counterattacks. If anyone could save Army Group Center, Model could. Model arrived to find not an army group, but a collection of shattered remnants streaming west. The scale of the disaster shocked even him. Entire corps had vanished. Divisions reported strengths in the hundreds, not thousands. Communication was sporadic at best. No one knew where friendly units were, where the Soviets were, where the front line was, if a front line even existed. Soviet mobile forces had penetrated over 100 miles deep. They were approaching Minsk, the capital of Byelorussia, the critical road and rail junction that supplied what remained of Army Group Center. Model's response was characteristically aggressive. He would not accept defeat. Retreating formations would stand and fight. Strong points would be established. Every available unit supply, troops headquarters, personnel training battalions, anyone with a weapon would be thrown into the line. The panzer divisions scattered across the theatre would concentrate for a decisive counterattack. He flew from headquarters to headquarters, relieving defeatist commanders, threatening cowards with execution, galvanizing officers through sheer force of personality. It made no difference. Model could not create armies through willpower. The panzer divisions he ordered to concentrate did not exist in any meaningful sense. The 5th Panzer Division reported 12 operational tanks. The 20th Panzer Division had been effectively destroyed at Vitebsk. The unit's model, ordered to form strong points, were already surrounded or fleeing west. His orders reached headquarters after the headquarters had been overrun. He was commanding phantoms. The Soviets took Minsk on July 3rd. With it went any hope of establishing a coherent defense line. Army Group Center's remaining forces were now cut off from supplies, reinforcements, communications. Soviet tank armies were loose in the operational depth racing west to cut off German retreat routes, encircle entire formations. The Wehrmacht was experiencing what it had inflicted on the Red Army in 1941. But in 1941, Soviet armies had endless space to retreat into bottomless manpower reserves to draw upon, and a leadership willing to trade space for time. The Germans had none of these advantages. The Minsk pocket was forming. East of the city, the remnants of the Fourth Army, perhaps 100,000 men, from a dozen shattered divisions, were being compressed into a steadily shrinking cauldron. Model ordered them to break out west. Hitler countermanded the order. They would hold in place, tie down Soviet forces, wait for relief. The soldiers in the pocket knew no relief was coming. They could hear Soviet artillery moving into position, see Soviet infantry tightening the ring, watch the Luftwaffe fail to deliver more than a handful of supply flights. But orders were orders. The pocket began collapsing on July 5th, not through formal surrender, but through progressive disintegration. Units ran out of ammunition and melted into the forests. Officers shot themselves rather than face captivity. Some formations attempted breakouts, small groups of desperate men trying to slip through Soviet lines at night. Most died in the attempt. The lucky ones were captured. By July 8th, organized resistance had ceased. The Soviets claimed 70,000 prisoners and counted 30,000 German dead in the pocket. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. The 57th Infantry, the 267th Infantry, the 6th Infantry veteran formations, with proud histories gone. But Bagration was not finished. With Minsk taken and the Fourth Army destroyed, Soviet forces continued west. The 3rd Panzer Army, defending the northern flank, was dissolving. The 9th Army in the south had practically ceased to exist. Model scraped together Kampfgruppen battle groups from the wreckage, improvised defensive lines, threw in the few reserves still available. Every stand delayed the Soviets by hours, sometimes days. Then the line would break again, and the retreat would continue. The German soldier of 1944 was not the supermen who had blitzkrieged across Europe in 1940. 3 years of Eastern Front combat had taken everything. These men had seen their friends die, had survived encirclements and winter retreats, had watched the Wehrmacht's myth of invincibility crumble. They were exhausted, half-starved fighting with obsolete equipment, but they were still professionals. They established ambushes, defended choke points, covered retreats. Company-sized units held Soviet divisions at bay for hours. Machine gun teams fought until overrun. The individual German soldier remained extraordinarily capable. It did not matter. Tactical excellence could not compensate for strategic insanity. Hitler's refusal to authorize timely withdrawals, his Festung obsession, his insistence that willpower could overcome material reality, these decisions transformed a serious defeat into a catastrophe. Every day spent holding indefensible positions was a day Soviet mobile forces could advance in circle cut off. Every garrison sacrificed in a Festung was a division that could have withdrawn in good order, that could have manned a defensive line further west, that could have preserved itself for future battles. Model kept trying. He was not a defeatist. He did not believe in accepting defeat. His counterattacks at Vilnius temporarily halted the Soviet advance. His defensive line along the Niemen River bought precious time. He concentrated scattered Kampfgruppen into something resembling divisions. Through sheer tenacity, Model prevented Bagration from becoming a complete rout, the destruction of Army Group Center, and a Soviet advance into Germany proper. The price was appalling. By the time Soviet momentum finally ran out in early August, Army Group Center had lost 28 divisions, not degraded, annihilated. The personnel losses exceeded 300,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment losses were staggering: over 2,000 tanks and assault guns, 10,000 artillery pieces, 57,000 vehicles. Entire corps headquarters ceased to exist. Divisional staffs were captured intact. The military infrastructure that made the Wehrmacht effective, experienced officers trained specialists, operational headquarters was gutted. The strategic implications were even worse. Bagration ripped a 250-mile gap in the Eastern Front. Soviet forces had advanced over 400 miles westward, liberating Belarus and reaching the borders of East Prussia. The Wehrmacht's central position, which had allowed shuttling reserves between threatened sectors, was gone. Army Group North was now isolated in the Baltic states. Army Group North, Ukraine's northern flank, was exposed. The door to Poland, to Germany itself, stood open. Why did it happen? The easy answer is Hitler's interference. His refusal to authorize withdrawals, his festering obsession, his detachment from reality. This is true, but incomplete. Hitler did not personally command every regiment, every division. His subordinates shared the blame. Busch's paralysis, his inability to act without explicit orders, his unwillingness to forcefully present the truth to Hitler, allowed the crisis to develop. Other commanders, Manstein, Rommel, Guderian, had clashed with Hitler, had pressed their cases, had sometimes won arguments through persistence. Busch simply obeyed. Model's aggressive counterattacks, while characteristic, may have worsened the disaster. Sending understrength Kampfgruppen against Soviet tank armies did not stop the offensive. It simply fed more men into the meat grinder. A more pragmatic commander might have recognized earlier that Army Group Center was finished, that the only rational goal was preserving whatever forces could be saved. But Model was not a pragmatist. He was a fighter, and fighters do not accept defeat. The institutional culture of the Wehrmacht played a role. German military training emphasized offensive action, aggressive counterattacks seizing initiative. Defense was temporary, a prelude to renewed attack. This mindset served Germany well in 1939 to 1941, when the Wehrmacht had material superiority and operational freedom. By 1944, continuing to think offensively when the strategic situation demanded elastic defense was suicidal. But institutional cultures do not change quickly, especially when the head of state is reinforcing the worst tendencies. There is something almost Greek about Army Group Center's destruction, a tragedy where everyone can see the disaster approaching, where the outcome is inevitable, where the protagonists march toward doom because they cannot act otherwise. Hitler could not authorize retreat because it violated his ideological convictions about willpower conquering material factors. Busch could not demand retreat because his entire career had been built on loyalty and obedience. Model could not stop counterattacking because his identity was bound up in never accepting defeat. The soldiers could not refuse orders because they were professional soldiers. Everyone played their assigned role, and 300,000 men died. The Red Army paraded 57,000 German prisoners through Moscow on July 17, 1944. They marched for hours, a river of field-grey misery, shuffling through the streets. The symbolism was deliberate. 3 years earlier, Nazi propaganda had shown Soviet prisoners in exactly this fashion. The crowds watched in silence. Some spat. Most simply stared. After the prisoners passed, street cleaners washed the avenues, literally washing away the remnants of Army Group Center. In the West, Operation Bagration received little attention. D-Day had occurred 3 weeks earlier. Allied armies were grinding through Normandy. The German disaster in Belarus was a sideshow to British and American audiences. But in terms of German losses, Bagration dwarfed Normandy. More divisions destroyed, more men captured, more territory lost. If you were trying to understand when Germany definitively lost World War II, Bagration has a stronger claim than most engagements. The Wehrmacht never recovered. Oh, it continued fighting. There would be the Ardennes offensive, the defense of Berlin, or the bloody endgame of the European war. But the military force that won in Poland and France and reached Stalingrad died in Belarus. The replacements who filled the shattered divisions were old men and boys scraped from the bottom of the manpower barrel. The officers who took command were promoted too fast, trained too little. The equipment was obsolete or non-existent. The Luftwaffe was a memory. The fuel was gone. The Wehrmacht of late 1944 wore the same uniforms, and used the same doctrine, but it was a fundamentally different, weaker organization. Hitler blamed his generals, of course. Bush was fired. Other commanders were relieved. The staff officers who had warned about the Soviet buildup were ignored or reassigned. The Festung concept remained official doctrine. Nothing was learned because learning required admitting error, and Hitler's ideological framework did not permit that. Better to believe in betrayal and cowardice than to confront the reality that Germany was losing because it was weaker, not because its soldiers lacked will. Army Group Center was rebuilt nominally. Surviving units were merged. Depleted divisions received paper reinforcements. The name continued to appear on organizational charts. But the formation that had been the spearhead of Barbarossa, that had taken Smolensk and Minsk and driven to Moscow's suburbs, that formation was gone. It had vanished from the earth in 8 weeks, destroyed by Soviet military competence, German strategic incompetence, and Hitler's ideological delusions. The soldiers who died in the Minsk pocket, who surrendered at Vitebsk, who were hunted down in the forests of Byelorussia, they were not monsters. They were men following orders, doing their duty, trying to survive in circumstances beyond their control. Their cause was evil, their country's war criminal, their leadership catastrophically bad. But the individual soldiers experienced the same fear, exhaustion, and desperation as soldiers throughout history. Their suffering was real, even if their cause was not. That is the tragedy of Army Group Center, not just that it was destroyed, but that it was destroyed needlessly. Different orders at critical moments could have preserved forces, maintained a coherent front, bought time. The catastrophe was not inevitable. It was manufactured through a combination of ideological rigidity, command paralysis, and institutional failings. 300,000 men died or were captured because their leaders valued obedience over competence, willpower over reality, loyalty over truth. Hitler's most trusted army vanished from the earth in 8 weeks. The Eastern Front never recovered. The road to Berlin lay open. The end was now simply a matter of time.